Hey friends, Pastor Jack here. You know, one of the things I do in my office when I have meetings is I like to serve tea. One of the reasons for that is because it's an opportunity for me to be able to show hospitality and generosity whenever people come and sit down and have a meeting with me. So I've got all the supplies ready for that. But one of the things that I think is really important is that even this, for me, is actually an expression of worship. Now you remember that one of the things that we say all the time here at Trinity Church is that worship isn't just about the songs that we sing, although it certainly includes that. Worship is actually more than that. Worship is about the way that we submit and sacrifice every area of our life to the lordship of our King. And one of the things that we've been talking about a lot is the fact that that does even include our money. It includes the resources that God has given us and the way that we have a chance to be able to give them back to Him as an expression of saying, Father, I trust you, not this paycheck. I don't trust my employer over you. I'm going to show you, watch. I'm going to give back to you a portion, a percentage, Father, of what you've given me as a way of showing that I trust you. And so one of the things that we like to do here is we'd like to give you an opportunity to do that. Not because we need the money. I mean, we certainly use the money of God's people to do things like pay for our staff salaries and our lights on and the programs that we operate to care for our kids. But really the issue is when we talk about giving, it's because you need you to give. It's who the Spirit of God becomes in you when you have a chance to, through a disciplined, regular way, say, Father, I give you back a portion of what you have entrusted to me as an act of worship. And brothers and sisters, I would tell you that if you say, I love coming to Trinity Church for the worship, but giving is not a part of what you do, then you are falling short of experiencing all that God would have for you in the submission and sacrifice of your entire life to His lordship and His kingship. So as we transition now to an opportunity to give, I would encourage you to consider that this isn't just about funding ministries. This is about the status of your heart, the worship of your spirit, and the submission of all that you have back to rightfully where it belongs, the feet of your King. Let's worship, friends.
Yeah. I'm about to engage in an act of worship. This is an act of worship for me. So I appreciate that from Jack. A few months ago, I took my son Elisha and then Adriel to a father-son retreat up at Camp Barakel. And if you're familiar with Camp Barakel, they have games kind of situated everywhere. And in the lobby of the dining hall and then in the lobby of the dorm rooms, they had these chessboards out. And Elisha has a little bit of a background in chess. He's learned it from his grandpa. And the boys started playing chess, and all of a sudden it just kind of took off. We played chess a lot that weekend. We did the regular camp things, but we played a lot of chess. And then when we got back, I noticed that the boys had both downloaded the chess app, and they were playing against each other. So I jumped in, I signed up and got the chess app, and we started playing with each other. And I found as we're playing this game of chess that there's this moment that occurs, and it happens to everyone, where you take a move and within a couple seconds you're like, oh, that was a bad move. And you long for this really cool thing called a take back. You want to get it back and put it back here because I want to undo all of this nastiness that I see coming. The take back. We all long for take backs, not just in chess, but in life. And today we're going to explore the doctrine of redemption. We've looked at the doctrines of biblical authority, the creation, and the fall in this little sub-mini series from our overall series from the book of Titus called Exiles. The fall that we looked at last week could easily snatch away any sense of hope that we might have. The fall leaves us in a state of longing for a take back. Can we just undo that move? And it could leave us in a permanent state of despair. But praise God, He has not abandoned us to the fall. What is redemption? All right, the dictionary definition is kind of bland. It just says it's the action of saving or being saved from sin, error, or evil. But I don't think it really helps us all that much to just sit here and define redemption today. I'd rather spend our time illustrating how redemption plays out in life. We're going to take a look at a story from the Old Testament about a man named Joseph. Joseph was born into a wealthy, blended family that owned a ton of livestock. Joseph's father, Jacob, had 2 wives, 2 mistresses, and 12 sons, and then we don't know how many daughters. Joseph was the second youngest, and then the very youngest, Benjamin. They were sons of the same mom, and their mom was the one that Jacob genuinely loved. So Joseph and Benjamin were kind of the favorites. Now, all that to say, Joseph had a complicated family life, probably, right? As a young man, he had a couple wild dreams that he had, and they were actually visions from God. Both visions that he got were about him and his family. Essentially, they were visions where he was going to be elevated to a position of power or authority over not only his brothers and sisters, but over his mom and dad even. And being a naive little kid with probably with a little bit of arrogance and a sense of superiority, he rushed and shot off his mouth and told them all about all these dreams that he had. I want to take a little side note. I'm going to be working my way through this story, and I'm going to be using some verses. And normally here at Trinity, we use the ESV just so that we can have some continuity. There are many translations. Use whatever translation you want. I'm not necessarily endorsing one or the other, but I'm going to be reading out of the NLT today, so it's not going to match the Bibles that we have. I'm kind of breaking form, and the only reason I'm doing it is because the NLT just reads and flows easier with a more natural language translation. But I'm making no endorsement of one translation over another. Genesis 37, 9 through 11 talk about Joseph revealing his second dream. He says, "So soon Joseph had another dream, and again he told his brothers about it. 'Listen, I've had another dream,' he said. 'The sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed low before me.' This time he told the dream to his father as well to his brothers, but his father scolded him. 'What kind of dream is that?' he asked. 'Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?' But while his brothers were jealous of Joseph, his father wondered what the dreams meant. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that Joseph is digging himself a hole with his family. And it plays out in a terrible way. A time comes later when Joseph's older brothers are off tending the flocks, and they've been gone for an extended period of time, and Jacob wants them back, so he sends Joseph to go get the brothers and bring them back. Genesis 37, when Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. As he approached, they made plans to kill him. 'Here comes the dreamer,' they said. 'Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we will see what becomes of his dreams.' Now, Reuben is the oldest brother. He's a little bit more level-headed, and he's like, 'Nah, guys, let's not kill him. Let's just throw him into the pit.' And Reuben has this secret plan. 'I'll just get him back to dad, and everything will be okay.' They do that. Reuben goes to do something, who knows what. And then we pick up the narrative again. It says, just as they were sitting down to eat, they looked up and saw a caravan of camels in the distance coming toward them. It was a group of Ishmaelite traders taking a load of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Gilead down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, 'What will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood.' And his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver. And the traders took him to Egypt." This is a classic Sunday school kind of story, and we may have heard it hundreds of times. What happens when we insert ourselves into it, though? Try to put yourself into Joseph's position, his frame of mind when he's in the pit or when he's being taken to Egypt. Let's imagine it together. He's just been violently apprehended and grabbed by his brothers and then thrown into a well. But he's the cocky favorite son of a wealthy father. So he's yelling and screaming out of the pit, "You guys better get me out of here. You know you're going to pay a price for this." But as hours drag on, he starts to get a little bit more desperate, and his arrogant demand starts to shift more into a cry and into a plea. So he cries out of the pit, "Guys, please let me go. I'm really hungry. I'm cut and I'm bruised. I could use some help." The day drones on, and the reality of his helplessness starts to sink into his once superior soul. He gets a moment of relief when he sees one of the brothers step up to the edge of the pit and lower him a rope. Okay, they got it. All right. "I got the message, guys. I'll stop being a jerk. I'm sorry." The brother pulls him up. And that momentary relief is snatched away when he looks up and he sees some traitors. And then the brother binds his hands. Oh, the relief is gone. He starts to cry and plead with them, but then that brother gags him while he watches another brother collect the equivalent of $200 for him. His own family has just sold him for a day's wages. He weeps the entire day as the Midianites travel all day towards Egypt. It might take a week to get there, but by the time he gets there, he is so exhausted from crying, and he just gives up on it. And he begins to accept the reality that his once good life is gone. He longs for a take back. He's sold into Egypt as the house servant to one of the wealthiest men of the nation. Somewhere along the way, Joseph does some business with the Lord. Somewhere along the way that he decided that even though his life had completely gone off the rails, he was going to try to honor this God that had given him these dreams and visions. How do I know that? Because at some point while he's serving this Egyptian master, the Egyptian master's wife starts to make a really aggressive pass at him, trying to get him to sleep with her. But Joseph wasn't having any of it. Listen to what he says. "But Joseph refused. 'Look,' he told her, 'my master trusts me with everything in this entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has withheld back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God.'" Okay, think about the implications of this. At this point in his narrative, Joseph is probably around 20 years old, maybe in his late teens. He's done really well in serving this Egyptian master Potiphar, and he's been put into a position of authority over everyone there. And with all of the garbage and all the injustice that had happened to him with his family, he could easily rationalize doing something really inappropriate with this woman. But God gives him grace to honor God with his choice in this moment and to resist her impulses. Eventually, she gets so sick of the rejection that she accuses Joseph of trying to rape her in a sordid scene. Potiphar believes his wife and throws Joseph into prison. So even though God had given Joseph grace to do the right thing, he paid the price as though he had actually done the thing of which he had been accused. And I imagine that this inflamed Joseph's sense of betrayal, and it triggered all of the same wounds from the first time that he was sold out. Imagine this conversation that he might have had with God. Be like, "God, why? I don't even deserve to be in Egypt. I don't deserve to be a servant. All I ever did wrong was share some dreams that you gave me. And this is what I get. And I've tried so hard to honor you. I've tried to be faithful. But it wasn't good enough, was it? I still have to pay for that one little mistake. It wasn't enough that you made me a slave, and now you're going to make me a prisoner. What about my brothers? When are they going to pay for what they did? What about Potiphar or his wife? Why am I the only one who ever has to suffer and pay for the simplest little thing that I did wrong?" Now, Joseph had one more betrayal to endure. Eventually, in prison, Joseph met two men whom Pharaoh had just thrown into prison. They were on Pharaoh's court. They were his cupbearer and his baker. Eventually in prison, both of those men had a dream in the same night. And Joseph sees them in the morning, and he can see that they're troubled. And he says, "Tell me what's wrong." They said, "Well, we've had some troubling dreams." And he says, Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. Okay, that claim is nuts. Because think about the last time Joseph had a dream. It cost him dearly. But he still trusts God with the interpretation of the dream. So he tells them the interpretations of their dreams. Long story short, the cupbearer is going to be put back into his position serving Pharaoh, and unfortunately, the baker is going to be executed. And Joseph begs the cupbearer, hey, when you go see Pharaoh, will you please tell him that there's a man in prison who really doesn't belong here and doesn't deserve to be here. But the cupbearer forgets. Completely forgets about Joseph. So Joseph has been betrayed, rejected, sold, falsely accused, and now forgotten. His life is a mess. And he can trace it all back to one tiny mistake of sharing his excitement about the dreams that he had with his family. I don't even know if you can call it a mistake. But here he sits, lonely, in prison. I think this is a familiar place for all of us. How many of us feel trapped in a prison? Whether it's a relational prison, a financial prison, an emotional prison, a prison of addiction, or whatever else it might look like. And a lot of the time we can trace the origin of our prison back to one fork in the road where we just made one small wrong turn. And we wish that we could have a take back. Here's a clip about someone wishing they could have a take back.
I was wondering when you were gonna get up. How long have I been out? I'd say a good 5 hours. Huh. I expected the Rocky Mountains to be a little rockier than this.
I was thinking the same thing.
I'm only human, Harry! Anybody can make a mistake. Come on! Stop being a baby! So we backtracked a tad. A tad? A tad, Lloyd? You drove almost a sixth of the way across the country in the wrong direction! Now we don't have enough money to get to Aspen. We don't have enough money to get home. We don't have enough money to eat. We don't have enough money to sleep. Well, it's not going to do us any good to sit here whining about it. We're in a hole. We're just going to have to dig ourselves out.
Okay, all right, you're right. You're absolutely right, Lloyd.
Where are you going?
Home. I'm walking home.
Oh, well, pardon me, Mr. Perfect. I guess I forgot that you never ever make a mistake. Got room for one more if you still want to go to Aspen.
Where did you find that?
Some kid back in town traded the van for it, straight up. I can get 70 miles to the gallon on this hog.
You know, Lloyd, Just when I think you couldn't possibly be any dumber, you go and do something like this. And totally redeem yourself!
Totally redeem yourself. If you haven't quoted that before, you need to start. That's one of my favorite scenes in any comedy. Lloyd's redemption is so preposterous. He's obviously dumber than a box of rocks, and he's in a mess of his own making. But with this just brash bravado of an actual genuine hero, he totally redeems himself and salvages their trip. I wonder if Joseph longed for a way to totally redeem himself. I wonder if he was wishing for a way that he could take and make the whole mess of his life into something that made any sense at all. But here's the problem. Unlike Lloyd, Joseph couldn't redeem himself. He was helpless. He was completely at God's mercy. But God was with Joseph. And in due time, God did the work only he can do. Eventually, Pharaoh himself had a troubling dream. And Joseph's story takes another turn. The cupbearer is listening to Pharaoh talk about this troubling dream, and he goes, oh man, I know a guy who knows a thing or two about dreams. So Pharaoh calls for Joseph, and Joseph's brought in, and Joseph interprets this dream for Pharaoh. Pharaoh believes him and puts him in charge of all of Egypt. So Joseph finally has relief from the imprisonment. He's redeemed out of it. He marries an Egyptian girl, and he has a couple of sons. He was lifted up out of the horrible pit that he had dug for himself and that his brothers had thrown him into. His life was redeemed. Now I wonder how much he thought about his past. Did he ever have a run-in with Potiphar or his wife? As the head cheese of all of Egypt, he could have done whatever he wanted to them. He could have made them pay. We have no record one way or another, but knowing that God regularly gave Joseph to do God-honoring things, we can assume that Joseph had forgiven them and that nothing came of it. Did Joseph think about his brothers? Did he long for a reconnection with his original family? Did Joseph miss his father? Did he miss his younger brother, Benjamin? Did he miss the brothers that had betrayed him? Though Joseph wasn't in slavery or in imprisonment anymore, there was a huge portion of his life that's still a mess. There's a huge ache in his heart that was in need of redemption. If you're unfamiliar with the story, Joseph was put in charge of Egypt because he prophesied from the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream that Egypt and the surrounding lands would go through 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of severe famine. And Pharaoh said, all right, I want you to manage the surplus from the abundance and prepare us for the famine. And Joseph did this really well. By the time that the famine actually came, Joseph was an established executor of the entire nation of Egypt. Probably about 20 years removed from being sold into slavery by his brothers. Picking back up in Genesis 41, it says this, so with severe famine everywhere, Joseph opened up the storehouses and distributed grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout the land of Egypt. And people from all around came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe throughout the world. When Jacob heard that grain was available in Egypt, he said to his sons, why are you standing around looking at one another? I heard there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy enough grain to keep us alive. Otherwise, we'll die. Now, the chapters that follow this are an amazing read. I'd highly encourage you, check out Genesis 42 through 45 when you get a chance. Just read through it. Ask the Lord to show you something about redemption from this passage. Okay, so Joseph's 10 brothers go to Egypt to buy some food, while Benjamin, the youngest brother, stays home with their father. Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they don't recognize him. So he interrogates them a little bit before selling them some grain. And he's doing it accusing them of being spies. It feels like he's playing a little bit of a game with them. In his questioning them, they reveal that they actually have a younger brother and a father back home. And so Joseph agrees to sell them some food, but insists that if they're going to come back for more, they have to bring that younger brother to prove their story. And then he keeps one of them hostage and sends the other 9 on their way. But he has his people put their money back into their sacks with the food that they sell him. I wondered for a long time, why did Joseph do these kinds of things with his brothers? If he had truly forgiven them, and if he saw God's hand in the whole thing and trusted God, why didn't he just come out and celebrate with them right away? Why didn't he send for the father and send for the younger brother immediately? Well, he missed them. Why did he delay the reunion? On their journey back home, the 9 brothers discover the money back in their sacks, and they're just panicked about it. This ridiculously powerful, established man in charge of all of Egypt has just grilled them and threatened their lives, and now they know that they're going to be accused of theft. When they get home, they tell their father about the events of their journey. And when Jacob hears that they have to bring Benjamin back if they want any more food, he loses it. He has been grieving the loss of Joseph for 20 years, and now his other favorite son is in the crosshairs of maybe the same fate. So he tells his family, no, you're not taking him. But the famine persists. And eventually they're left with no choice. So Jacob tells his sons, go get some more food from Egypt. And they're like, no, not unless Benjamin comes. Genesis 43, Judah said to his father, send the boy with me, and we will be on our way. Otherwise, we will all die of starvation. And not only we, but you and our little ones. I personally guarantee his safety. You may hold me responsible if I don't bring him back to you. Then let me bear the blame forever. Jacob relents and he lets them take Benjamin. When they get back to Egypt, they immediately come clean about the money that they had. And you can sense that they're anxious and they're getting overwhelmed by this fear from this man. Joseph tells them to chill out, the money's not a problem, and then he invites them to dinner. After dinner, he sends them on their way, but he sets a little trap for them. He has one of his people take his silver cup, his special cup for dinner and for divining and all that kind of stuff, and hide it in Benjamin's sack. And again, I'm struggling trying to figure out why Joseph is setting his brothers up like this. It seems like he's manipulating them, or he's trying to get them to feel miserable for all the stuff that they did to him. If he was truly forgiving, why wouldn't he just welcome them in? I think sometimes we forget that the heroes of the Bible were just humans like you and I. Joseph was a man, dependent at every step on God's grace. I don't think Joseph hatched some scheme to lead his brothers on a fantastic journey. He was probably really struggling with this whole encounter. He was wondering how and when to reveal to them who he was. The whole thing had to be deeply triggering for him as he wrestled with the trauma of all the harm that had been done to him and how to respond to this new dynamic that was playing out with his family. The brothers leave Egypt. Joseph sends an armed contingent after them to bring them back. This armed group of men catch up with them and accuse them of stealing their master's cup. And the brothers deny it. No, we didn't take any cup. And in fact, if you find any of us with the cup, you can kill that man. So they get off their camels, and the armed contingent starts searching their sacks. And every step of the way, they get a little bit more relief. Okay, good, we're good. But as they go through the brothers, more and more eyes turn to Benjamin. And their hearts just die inside of them when the stolen property is found in Benjamin's sack. They're devastated. These brothers who have been tormented by guilt for decades for selling their younger brother Joseph into slavery now have to face the music that they have just condemned their other youngest brother to death. They tear their clothes and they're escorted back to the man with all the power in the world to destroy them for what they've done. Joseph seems harsh with them. He says, "What is this that you have done? The man who stole my cup will become my slave forever." In other words, you just sold your other younger brother into bondage just like you did 20 years ago. There will be no redemption for you. There will be no redemption. You will bear the guilt of this forever. You see, friends, Joseph was sold, but it was his brothers who went into bondage, especially Judah. You can see in their distress at losing Benjamin that the guilt had been tearing at them for decades. They had betrayed their father. They had condemned a younger brother to a life of unjust slavery, and their foolishness with this Egyptian master had just condemned another younger brother to the same thing. They knew that when they got home, their dad was going to die from grief over this failure. Joseph's brothers were desperate for redemption. Judah steps forward. The ringleader who decades prior had stepped up and convinced the rest of the brothers to sell Joseph into slavery was now stepping up with a cry for redemption. He reminds this powerful man with all the power that can do whatever he wants to them of the story that has led up to this point. And then with intimate accuracy explains how much it's going to devastate his family to see another brother sold into slavery. Listen to the change of Judah's softened heart. Genesis 44, and now, my Lord, I cannot go back to my father without the boy. Our father's life is bound up in the boy's life. If he sees that the boy is not with us, our father will die. We, your servants, will indeed be responsible for sending that grieving white-haired man to his grave. My Lord, I guaranteed my father that I would take care of the boy. I told him, if I don't bring him back to you, I will bear the blame forever. So please, my Lord, let me stay here as a slave instead of the boy. And let the boy return with his brothers. For how can I return to my father if the boy is not with me? I couldn't bear to see the anguish this would cause my father. That's the cry of a man tormented by guilt. He had sold his innocent brother into a life of slavery, and now he was faced with the same brutal reality again. And I can hear so much pain in his voice. The cry of a man desperate to be free of guilt. Judah was dying for redemption, and he's crying out to this apparent tyrant, please let me take his place. I'm begging you, take me, but let him go. 1,000,000 times over, I want to protect my brother. I'll be the one sold. Please let me pay the price instead of him. Please, I want a take back. I'd rather be your slave than in bondage to this guilt. Take me. And I can almost see the other brothers behind him all crying the same thing. Any one of them would have gladly taken Benjamin's place. Joseph was sold, but it was his brothers who went into bondage. And at this moment, Joseph could see his brother's anguish, and it all came together for him. His prophesied position of power wasn't meant for him to lord it over them, but for him to serve them. Genesis 45, Joseph couldn't stand it any longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, out, all of you. So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. I am Joseph, he said to his brothers. Is my father still alive? But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. Please, come closer, he said to them. So they came closer, and he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me into this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. Friends, this is redemption. Redemption is the setting free a slave of sin. It's not just overlooking sin and pretending like it didn't happen. It's not just refraining from exacting justice on the sinner. It's setting the sinner free. Joseph could have overlooked his brother's fault and welcomed them into his presence, but they would have remained in bondage to their guilt. And with this whole scenario, God, through Joseph, had truly set them free from their sin. Not only did God set the brothers free, he set Joseph fully free. Sin does not only ensnare the sinner, it can also ensnare the victim. God doesn't just offer redemption to the offender, he offers it to the offended. Redemption is the setting free a slave of sin, no matter how they were sold into it. Now, of course, in life, the setting free isn't necessarily as clean or as simultaneous as this story, but God definitely loves and seeks to redeem both the sinner and the victim. This is a direct foreshadowing and a picture of the redemption God provides for us in Jesus Christ. God does not just overlook our sin. He does not just welcome us into his presence and pretend that nothing ever happened. No, he sets us free from our sin and redeems us from it. He doesn't only set free the sinner, but he redeems the wounded and the victimized as well. And those who are truly redeemed are not only made free from the consequences of their sin, they're made free from their sin. Judah was not the same man who sold his brother into slavery. Redeemed Judah was a man who stepped up to the plate, volunteered to be sold himself, rather than let his apparently guilty brother Benjamin go into slavery. Joseph was not the same arrogant child who rushed to proclaim his superiority. He was now patient, careful, and kind. This is the power of redemption. It's actually not that hard to see ourselves in this kind of story, is it? And there are some lessons that we can learn from Joseph and his brothers. The first lesson is sin always sells the sinner into bondage and slavery. Sin promises many things. In the brothers' case, they thought it might fetch them a little bit of profit. They thought that it might help them get rid of an annoying little brother. They thought that ultimately, though, it was going to relieve them of feeling inferior and like they weren't preferred by their father. But sin is a liar. Sin promises liberty and answers, but it only delivers bondage. We are susceptible to these same traps. Virtually every sin that we find ourselves in begins with some kind of promise of something good, and then we believe that lie, but before we know it, we're in bondage to it. Secondly, we, just like Joseph and his brothers, are helpless when it comes to our own redemption. We cannot totally redeem ourselves. This family was a total disaster. Their father had played favorites. They had grieved him beyond belief. They had sold one brother into slavery, and they were all in bondage of sin of one form or another. They were all completely helpless to change the situation. Their guilt and slavery was way too much for them to handle. The remedy was beyond them. They were dependent on redemption from an outside source. Judah and the other brothers were incapable of undoing the past. Likewise, we are dependent for our redemption. Even Joseph could not get himself out of slavery. Following closely with God and trying to honor God with his choices could not provide redemption for him. This is crucial. Even Joseph was utterly dependent on God to redeem him out of slavery and imprisonment. So let's not deceive ourselves by thinking that we can just make some God-honoring choices and redeem our own lives. We cannot. Even Joseph was dependent on God for redemption. Third, we have to humbly cooperate with our redemption. When the timing for redemption for Joseph's brothers came, they had to cooperate with it. Their chance for redemption didn't necessarily show up with some big announcement and fanfare saying, this is your moment. But when the time came, they had to own up to their guilt. They had to acknowledge it. And they had to submit themselves to the consequences. And then when the curtain was pulled back and forgiveness was freely offered, they had to accept it. When Joseph's time came, he didn't shoot his mouth off about the cupbearer forgiving him. He didn't go after Potiphar and his wife. At least we don't think he did. He didn't send an army to Canaan to destroy his brothers. No, Joseph honored God. When Pharaoh asked about his ability to interpret dreams, he said the power to interpret belongs to God. The spoiled, entitled boy was now gone at this point, and Joseph gave glory to God instead of seeking glory and superiority for himself. And then lastly, those who are truly redeemed are empowered as agents of redemption to use whatever means they have to facilitate redemption for others. This is a crucial point for us to consider. Joseph clearly had to have been tempted to just fall into the abyss of unforgiveness, bitterness, resentment, but he didn't take any of that bait. Somewhere along the way in his journey, he had done business with the Lord, and the Lord had set him free from those things. Listen again to how he described his understanding of his journey when he talked to his brothers. He said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt." It's right there. He didn't just overlook what they did. But he says, "But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me into this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives." A sure sign of a redeemed person is that they can see God in the harm that has been done to them. We don't really know how Joseph got to that point. The Bible doesn't describe his internal process of getting to that point, but we can see evidence of it in the way that he handled his brothers. And in a way, this alludes to us. We don't really know how it works, but you can tell the people who are truly free and who have truly been redeemed, and that they are the ones who quickly forgive others. They're the ones who constantly use whatever means, whatever authorities, whatever advantages that they have to facilitate the redemption of others. I do want to be careful with this idea of facilitating redemption in others, because as humans, we don't actually have the means to redeem anyone. What I mean by facilitating redemption is that we point others to Jesus, who is the actual source of our eternal redemption. Jesus is the source, only source of redemption for us. And we're looking forward to that over the next few weeks. And at this time, I'd like to invite the prayer team and the elders to come down. They'll be down here at the end of the service to pray with you if you have anything that you'd like to pray about. But over the coming weeks, we're going to be looking at Jesus, the source of redemption. Next week is Palm Sunday, and we're going to be talking about the incarnate Messiah. This Jesus, this God, stepped out of the eternal glories that were rightfully his and became a man for our redemption. And then we have Good Friday, where this man, God, Jesus, submits himself to pay the price for our redemption on a cross. And hallelujah, that is not the end of the story. Resurrection Sunday is quickly after that, where Jesus sets the captives free. I pray and hope that you'll be joining us as we look at where the source of redemption comes. Father, I thank you so much that you did not abandon me helpless, that you didn't abandon any of us, that you saw our need for a take back. You saw the devastation that we deserved, and you weren't satisfied with it. But you offered redemption that came at a very high cost to you. Jesus, you are our King. You are the Lord of glory. We love you. Give us grace to cooperate with your redemption, and then give us grace to be agents of redemption that point the way to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Just a quick reminder, baptisms on Wednesday. If the Lord stirred you and you're interested in that, check that box, drop it in the giving boxes. And Carolyn, I know she would be totally excited to get with you this week. Thank you. Have a great week.